Smoke still hung in the air, drifting like dark clouds over the broken city. The streets were empty, except for the occasional piece of debris rolling in the wind. Daniel Hayes, a human soldier, walked carefully between the ruins. His boots crunched over shattered glass and bits of stone. Somewhere in the distance, he could still hear the faint echo of explosions. But the fighting in this part of the city had mostly stopped. It was then that he heard a sound, soft at first, but enough to make him pause. It wasn't the sound of gunfire or machinery. It was higher, sharper, filled with pain. A baby's cry. Daniel frowned, trying to pinpoint the direction. The wind carried the sound, making it hard to tell where it came from. He turned down a narrow alley, stepping over a fallen metal beam, his rifle held low but ready. The crying grew louder, mixed with what sounded like a woman's voice, soft, trembling, speaking words he didn't understand. He moved slowly, scanning the shadows. The alley opened into what used to be a small community courtyard. The walls were blackened with scorch marks. Part of the roof had collapsed, and the smell of burnt wood filled the air. In the far corner, he saw her. A young alien woman sat on the cracked ground, her back against a half-broken wall. Her skin was a pale shade of blue, with faint silver markings that shimmered when the light caught them. Her eyes, large, luminous, and full of fear, watched him carefully. In her arms, wrapped in a thin, tattered blanket, was a tiny infant. The baby's face was scrunched up, mouth open wide, screaming with all the strength it had left. Daniel stopped a few steps away. She clutched the child tighter, shifting as if to shield the baby from him. He could see she was exhausted. Her clothes were dusty and torn, her hair tangled, her cheeks streaked with dried tears. He lifted one hand slowly, palm outward, the universal sign for, "I mean no harm." "It's okay," he said gently, though he knew she couldn't understand his words. "I'm not here to hurt you." The baby's cries pierced the air again, echoing off the stone walls. The sound was desperate, not just the usual hungry cry of an infant. It was sharper, more urgent, the kind of cry that made his chest tighten. Daniel glanced around. This area was still dangerous. There could be stray fire, traps, or collapsing buildings. But walking away felt impossible. That sound? It pulled at something deep inside him. Slowly, he crouched down to make himself less threatening. He slipped off his backpack and rummaged through it, pulling out a small packet of field rations. He opened it halfway, letting her see it clearly, then placed it on the ground in front of him before sliding it toward her. She shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. Through her body language, he understood. The baby wouldn't eat. The child's wails grew weaker, yet somehow more painful to hear. The woman rocked back and forth, trying to comfort the infant, whispering in her own language. Daniel watched. For a moment, then took a slow breath and reached his hands out slightly toward her, not touching, but offering. Her eyes narrowed in caution. For a few seconds, she didn't move. Then, with visible reluctance, she loosened her hold just enough to place the baby in his arms. The infant was lighter than he expected, the small body trembling from the effort of crying. Daniel adjusted his grip instinctively, supporting the tiny head, tucking the blanket more securely around the child. He remembered how his sister's newborn used to calm when held a certain way. Head resting near the shoulder, gentle rocking, steady warmth. He began to sway slightly, keeping his voice soft as he hummed a tune from home. It was a human lullaby, one his mother used to sing when the nights were long and restless. The melody was simple, almost like a whisper against the chaos of the ruined city. At first, nothing changed. The baby's cries went on, though slightly less sharp. But then, as Daniel continued, the sound began to fade. The small fists that had been clenched so tightly loosened, and the trembling slowed. The woman's expression shifted. She leaned forward, her gaze fixed on her child. Her lips parted slightly in surprise, as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. A human soldier, someone her people had likely been taught to fear, was holding her child as gently as if it were his own. Daniel glanced at her and gave a small nod, a silent promise that he wasn't going to harm them. The baby let out one last weak cry, then sighed and rested its head against his chest. Somewhere far off, a voice over his radio called his name, telling him to regroup. But Daniel stayed where he was for just a little longer. The war could wait. For a few minutes. Right now, this baby needed peace more than the battlefield needed another soldier. And in that quiet courtyard, with smoke still curling in the air and destruction all around, a fragile moment of trust began to form between two strangers from different worlds, because one soldier had stopped to listen to a cry. Daniel stayed crouched on the broken ground, still rocking the baby slowly. The infant's tiny breaths were uneven, but at least the cries had softened. He could feel the small heartbeat against his chest, rapid but steady. The alien woman kept, watching him, her eyes narrowing whenever he shifted his arms. She seemed torn between relief and suspicion. The wind whistled through the collapsed courtyard, carrying the smell of dust and burnt metal. Somewhere nearby, a piece of roof creaked as it threatened to fall. Daniel knew they shouldn't stay out in the open for too long, but he also knew he couldn't just hand the child back and walk away. Something was wrong, and not just because of the war. He glanced at the woman again. She hugged her knees and kept her arms wrapped around herself, as if trying to shield her body from an invisible cold. Her gaze kept flicking between Daniel's face and the baby in his arms. She didn't speak his language, but her expression was easy to read. She was waiting to see if he would hurt them or help them. Daniel slowly unzipped a pouch on his vest and took out his canteen. He tipped it slightly, letting her see the clean water inside. She stared at it for a moment, then shook her head, pointing to the baby and making a soft, frustrated sound. The child was too young for water. Daniel nodded, understanding. He wished he had formula or something that might help, but the standard soldier's rations didn't come with baby supplies. A shadow passed over them as two other soldiers entered the courtyard from the far side. One was Corporal Rains, a tall man with a sharp voice. "Hayes!" he called, his tone half annoyed, half curious. "What are you doing? We've got orders to sweep the East Block." Daniel kept his voice low, trying not to startle the baby again. "There's a problem here. The kid's in bad shape. I think they need help." Rains glanced at the alien woman, then at the child, and frowned. "They're not our mission. Orders are orders." Daniel tightened his hold on the infant, keeping his tone firm. "If this were your family, would you want me to just walk away?" Rains hesitated, then muttered something under his breath and waved to the other soldier to move on. "Fine. Do what you want, but don't take too long." As the others left, Daniel returned his attention to the woman. He pointed to himself and said clearly, "Daniel." Then he gestured toward her, lifting his eyebrows in a silent question. She hesitated before speaking a single word in a soft voice. Lyra. Her name. It was short and gentle, yet carried a weight he couldn't define. Daniel nodded and repeated it carefully, hoping his accent didn't twist it too badly. Lyra blinked, surprised that he tried to say it at all. He then pointed at the child, tilting his head to ask for the name. She whispered something, a name with soft syllables he couldn't fully catch. He repeated the sound as best as he could, and her expression softened just slightly. Daniel adjusted his hold on the baby and began humming again. The tune seemed to draw the child's attention, the tiny fingers twitching against his uniform. He could feel the baby's breathing slow, the trembling in the small body easing bit by bit. Lyra's eyes followed every movement. At one point, she reached out hesitantly, touching the edge of the blanket as if to make sure it was still wrapped tightly. Daniel shifted his position so she could see clearly, making sure the baby was secure. Minutes passed like that, quiet except for the faint hum of his voice. In that time, Daniel realized something important. This wasn't just about stopping a cry. It was about showing her that he wasn't an enemy, that humans weren't just soldiers with weapons. From the corner of his eye, he saw a faint movement, a man from the civilian side peering around the edge of a broken wall. The moment their eyes met, the man vanished back into the shadows. Daniel didn't chase him. He knew that for many in this city, humans were still strangers to be feared. But maybe if they saw him holding this child, maybe if they saw Lyra wasn't running away, some of that fear might begin to fade. The baby stirred and gave a soft whimper. Daniel looked down and saw the small eyes blinking open. He gave a faint smile and whispered, "Hey there, you're okay now." Of course, the child didn't understand his words, but tone mattered. Tone could bridge gaps that language couldn't. The baby stared up at him for a moment, then made a faint, almost questioning sound before nuzzling into the blanket again. Lyra tilted her head, studying the way he spoke to her child. She said something in her language, slow, deliberate, but Daniel couldn't understand. Still, her voice didn't have the sharp edge it had before. It sounded calmer. A noise from the street made Daniel glance over his shoulder. His instincts told him it was time to move somewhere safer. He gestured toward a nearby wall that looked more stable and motioned for her to follow. She hesitated, clutching the torn fabric of her clothing, but when he stepped forward, she rose to her feet and followed, staying close. Once they were in a safer corner, Daniel handed the baby back. Lyra accepted her child carefully, still watching him as if trying to decide whether she could truly trust him. But her hands no longer trembled as much, and when the baby let out a soft coo instead of a cry, her eyes glistened. Daniel didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if they'd meet again or if the war would pull them apart. But in that moment, something had shifted. It was no longer just a soldier and a civilian from opposite sides of a conflict. It was a man, a woman, and a child, bound, if only for a short time, by the simple act of kindness. Daniel stayed close to the wall, scanning the street for any movement. The baby was quiet now, resting in Lyra's arms, but his soldier's instincts told him that peace in a war zone never lasted long. Still, the moment felt different, less tense, almost fragile, as if something important was slowly unfolding. A few minutes later, the crunch of boots on rubble made him turn. This time, it wasn't another soldier. It was one of the local interpreters assigned to their unit, a middle-aged man named Harun. His clothes were worn but clean, and he carried himself with a quiet dignity. He nodded respectfully to Daniel before turning his attention to Lyra. "Ask her what's wrong with the baby," Daniel said without hesitation. "Why has the child been crying so much?" Harun spoke in Lyra's language, his voice calm and gentle. Lyra's eyes welled up, almost instantly. She clutched the baby tighter and began speaking quickly, her words tumbling over each other. Harun listened carefully, nodding from time to time, his brow furrowing. When she finally stopped, he turned back to Daniel with a heavy expression. "She says the child has been in pain for days. Since the bombing 2 nights ago, the baby cries constantly. She thinks something inside is hurt, maybe ribs, maybe breathing. She has no medicine, no clean water. She tried everything she knows, but nothing works. The baby refuses food and barely sleeps." Daniel felt a cold weight settle in his chest. He had suspected something was wrong, but hearing it confirmed made his stomach tighten. "We need a medic," he said firmly. Harun's eyes shifted toward the direction of the command post. "Your orders were to patrol. They may not approve calling a medic here. There are rules." Daniel shook his head sharply. "I don't care about the rules right now. A child's in pain." He pulled his radio from his vest and keyed it on. "Base, this is Hayes. I need a medic at my location immediately. Civilian, infant injured. Possible internal damage. Repeat. Infant injured. Static crackled before the reply came. Hayes, your orders are to continue patrol. We can't divert resources right now. Daniel's jaw tightened. He glanced at the baby, at Lyra's pale, worried face, and pressed the radio button again. If you don't send a medic, the child could die. I'm not moving until help gets here. There was a pause on the other end, long enough that he wondered if they'd just ignore him. Then came the reluctant reply. Copy that, Hayes. Medic, en route. ETA 10 minutes. Stay put. Lyra didn't understand the words, but she seemed to sense the shift in his tone. She looked at Haroun, who explained in her language. Her shoulders relaxed slightly, though she still rocked the baby gently, whispering soft words that Daniel guessed were comfort. Those 10 minutes felt longer than any battle Daniel had been in. Every small sound from the baby made him tense, worried it was a sign the child's condition was worsening. He kept glancing down the street, listening for the familiar sound of boots and gear. Finally, the medic appeared, a short, quick-moving woman named Torres. She dropped to one knee beside them, setting down her medical kit. What have we got? She asked briskly. Daniel explained what he knew while Haroun translated to Lyra. Torres washed her hands with a small bottle of sanitizer and reached for the baby, but Lyra hesitated. She looked at Daniel, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. Daniel gave her a small nod. It's okay. She's here to help. Slowly, Lyra passed the baby over. Torres worked with practiced hands, checking the child's breathing, gently pressing. Along the ribs, listening with a tiny stethoscope. The baby whimpered, but didn't cry. After a few minutes, Torres gave her assessment. Minor fracture in the ribs, likely from a blast shock wave. Some dehydration, mild fever. It's painful, but treatable. I'll give pain relief, fluids, and something for the fever. The ribs will heal if the child's kept safe and rested. Haroun translated, and Lyra's eyes filled with tears again. This time not from fear, but from relief. She reached for Daniel's hand, gripping it briefly before letting go. Torres handed Daniel a small dropper filled with clear liquid. Hold the baby. It'll be easier for her if you give it. Daniel took the child gently, feeling the fragile weight in his arms again. He tilted the dropper carefully into the tiny mouth, pausing when the baby made a faint sound. After a few drops, the child swallowed, then rested more heavily against him. Torres set up a small IV bag with fluids and secured it to the baby's blanket so it could be carried safely. This should help within the hour, she said. I'll leave some supplies with you in case she needs more. When the medic left, Daniel stayed a while longer. The baby was calmer now, eyes half closed. Lyra touched the edge of the blanket, her fingers brushing Daniel's hand by accident. She murmured something soft, and Haroun smiled faintly. She says, Haroun translated, that she didn't know humans could be so gentle. She thought you only carried weapons, but today you carried her child. Daniel looked at Lyra, meeting her gaze. Tell her, we're not all here to fight. Some of us are here to protect. Haroun relayed the message. Lyra didn't speak again, but she gave a slow nod, her expression thoughtful. As Daniel prepared to move back toward his patrol route, he realized something had shifted in the air around them. It wasn't just that the baby was calmer. It was that Lyra now looked at him not as an enemy, but as a man who had chosen to stand still in a war zone for the sake of a child. And in a place where trust had been shattered by years of fighting, that was no small thing. Night began to fall over the city, bringing with it a strange quiet. The echoes of battle were replaced by the distant crackle of small fires and the low hum of generators from the soldiers' camp. The sun's fading light painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, casting long shadows through the broken streets. Daniel stayed near Lyra and the baby, making sure the child remained comfortable. The medicine Torres had given was working. The baby no longer cried in pain, but instead made soft, sleepy sounds. Lyra's tense shoulders had eased a little, though she still kept the infant close to her chest, as if she feared someone might take the child away. Daniel sat against a half-collapsed wall, his rifle resting nearby but untouched. He was aware of other soldiers moving through the streets, keeping watch. But here, in this small, quiet corner, there was a different atmosphere. It was no longer just a war zone. It felt almost like a safe space, at least for the moment. He noticed the way people were beginning to look at them. A few civilians, mostly women and older men, appeared in the distance. They stood at the edges of the street, peeking around corners or from behind broken doors. At first, they watched with suspicion, their eyes sharp and guarded. But as they saw Lyra sitting beside a human soldier without fear, and saw her child resting peacefully, they lingered longer. One elderly man stepped closer, carrying a small basket. He placed it a few meters away, then retreated quickly. Inside the basket was a bundle of flatbread wrapped in cloth. Lyra glanced at it, then at Daniel, as if unsure whether it was safe. Daniel reached forward, checked the bread, and gave a small nod. She took it, breaking off a piece with careful hands. As the night deepened, Daniel's commanding officer, Captain Rourke, arrived to check on the patrol. Rourke's boots crunched on the debris as he approached, his expression unreadable. "Hayes," he said in a low voice, "I heard you delayed patrol to wait for a medic." Daniel stood, meeting his gaze. "Yes, sir. The child was injured." "I wasn't going to leave them like that." Rourke studied him for a long moment, then glanced at Lyra and the baby. His eyes softened slightly. "You know, Hayes, sometimes winning a war isn't about the battles we fight, but the hearts we change." That was not what Daniel had expected to hear. The captain gave him a short nod before walking off, speaking quietly into his radio. A few minutes later, 2 soldiers from the supply tent arrived carrying a small package. Inside were blankets, bottled water, and a pouch of nutrient mix safe for alien infants. One soldier also brought a small heating unit, just enough to keep the cold away for the night. Lyra's eyes widened as she took in the items. She touched the soft blanket, then the bottle of water, as though she couldn't believe they were really for her. Harun explained in her language that these were gifts from the human soldiers, meant to help her child recover. She glanced at Daniel again, her voice trembling as she said something short but full of meaning. Harun smiled faintly. "She says you have brought warmth to her child and to her heart." Daniel didn't know what to say to that, so he simply nodded. The change in the air was undeniable. Other civilians began approaching, not too close at first, but enough to exchange small greetings with Harun. A few asked if Daniel's unit could spare medicine for an old wound or a bag of clean water. Normally, the locals avoided human soldiers entirely. But tonight, because of one act of kindness, they came forward. Daniel helped where he could, giving out small items from his own pack, an extra canteen, a wrapped protein bar, even a pair of gloves he wasn't using. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make the stranger's eyes light with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. Later, when the stars began to appear, Daniel sat again near the heating unit. Lyra was on his right, the baby sleeping soundly in her lap. She hummed something low and melodic, a song in her own language. Even without understanding the words, Daniel could feel the tenderness in the tune. Harun, sitting nearby, spoke quietly. "Your actions today will be remembered. News travels fast here. By tomorrow, half the district will know that a human soldier saved an alien child." Daniel tilted his head. "Do you think it'll matter?" Harun gave a small smile. "In war, trust is rare. A single act can open a door that 1,000 speeches cannot. You may have just opened that door. Daniel leaned back, letting that thought sink in. He hadn't planned to make a statement. He had simply acted because the idea of leaving a suffering baby alone felt wrong, but maybe small moments like this could ripple outward. As the night grew colder, Daniel adjusted the heating unit so the warmth spread toward Lyra and the baby. She gave him a quick glance, and this time her eyes no longer carried suspicion. Instead, they held a quiet acknowledgement, a recognition that they were no longer just strangers forced together by circumstance. When his shift ended, Daniel was reluctant to leave. He handed Lyra an extra packet of nutrient mix and gestured toward the blankets, making sure she knew to keep them wrapped tightly around the baby. She nodded, her silver-marked face calm under the faint glow of the heating unit. As he walked back toward camp, Daniel looked over his shoulder one last time. Lyra was still there, rocking her child, the new blanket wrapped around them both. The baby didn't cry. The air around them seemed lighter, and in the middle of a war zone, that small change felt like a victory. Weeks passed, and the front lines of the war had moved far away from the city. The streets that had once been filled with smoke and rubble now carried a softer air, though the scars of battle were still visible in every shattered wall and cracked pavement. Daniel Hayes continued his patrols, but his mind often wandered back to the small corner where he had first met Lyra and her baby. Lyra had begun visiting the human camp regularly. Each time she arrived, the baby, now slightly older and sturdier, was in her arms, curious and alert. The child's cries were replaced with laughter and soft coos, and each visit seemed to deepen the bond between them. Daniel would kneel to greet the child, and the little one would reach out with tiny hands, as if recognizing him as a friend. The simple act of trust had grown into something larger than anyone could have predicted. Word of the incident had spread, first among the soldiers and then through the local community. People began to see the human soldiers differently, not just as outsiders with weapons, but as potential allies, as people who could help rather than harm. Lyra had become a quiet bridge between the two sides. She would speak with Daniel and the other soldiers through Harun, translating her experiences and concerns. Slowly, her courage inspired other civilians to reach out as well. Requests for basic aid, water, blankets, food were now met with assistance rather than suspicion. The small acts of kindness began to weave a fragile thread of trust through the city. One morning, Lyra brought the child to the camp and placed a small handmade gift in Daniel's hands, a soft cloth, colored, with bright patterns that shimmered in the sunlight. "For you," she said in her language. Harun translated. She wanted to thank him for protecting her child, for showing that not all humans were enemies. Daniel looked at the cloth, then at the baby who was clapping small hands in delight, and felt a warmth that had little to do with the sun. Later, during a briefing with his unit, Daniel noticed his commanding officer watching him. Captain Rourke cleared his throat. "Hayes, you may have started something that no one expected. Actions like yours, simple, human acts of care, can change more than a strategy or a plan. Sometimes, they save more lives than a patrol ever could." Daniel nodded quietly. He didn't think of himself as a hero. He had only held a baby and waited for help to arrive. Yet the truth was clear. By stepping in, he had sparked a ripple effect that touched many lives. Back in the city, the community began to recover slowly. Children played in the streets where fear once dominated. Families shared what little food they had, and the elders told stories of hope and survival. Daniel often walked through these streets during downtime, and he saw families who now smiled when a human soldier passed by. Lyra would wave from a distance, the baby toddling beside her, and Daniel would wave back, feeling a quiet pride. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in gold and purple, Lyra and the child visited again. The baby, now able to speak, a few words babbled excitedly, pointing toward Daniel and laughing. He knelt down, holding out his hands, and the little one ran into them, giggling. Lyra smiled, and her silver-marked face shone in the fading light. Harun translated her words. She wanted him to know that her child would remember him always, not just for saving its life, but for showing kindness. The ripple continued beyond the city. Soldiers who had once seen civilians as obstacles began to help whenever they could. Even the locals started to believe that peace might be possible. All of it traced back to one small act: stopping, listening, and caring for a crying baby. Daniel sometimes thought about how small actions could matter. So much. In the middle of war, he had held a child, calmed its fears, and by doing so, changed the hearts of many around him. He realized that courage wasn't always about facing the enemy. It was about choosing compassion when it mattered most. Years later, Daniel would remember Lyra and her child with clarity. The city had rebuilt, though scars remained. The baby had grown into a lively young child full of curiosity and laughter, often visiting Daniel whenever he passed through. Their bond had become a symbol of hope, showing that even in the darkest times, humanity, human or alien, could shine through. And every time the child saw him, there was no fear, no hesitation, only recognition and joy. That small act of kindness, in a quiet corner of a ruined city, had changed lives forever. It had reminded Daniel, and everyone who witnessed it, that even amidst destruction, a single human gesture could ripple outward, transforming fear into trust, sorrow into hope, and despair into a chance for something better. In the end, Daniel understood something profound. Wars could destroy cities, but kindness could rebuild hearts. And in that truth, he found a sense of purpose deeper than any mission he had ever been given.